Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William McKinley, and the focus is Reelection and Assassination. The year is 1900. It is an election year, and McKinley had every reason to be optimistic. He was riding a wave of popularity. His economy was booming. Exports were at an all-time high, thanks in part to some new reciprocity agreements that had been negotiated on his watch. Prosperity was certainly the watchword for the entire economy. And in foreign affairs, the country had really united around the victory in the Spanish-American War, the handling of those peace negotiations, expansion, getting these new lands as part of the United States, manifest destiny all over again. Boy, this was a real different United States according to William McKinley himself from the time that he got in office. And so it has come to pass that in a few short months we have become a world power, he said. And I know sitting here in this chair with what added respect the nations of the world now deal with the United States, and it is vastly different from the condition I found when I was inaugurated. Much of that credit would go to William McKinley. Now, according to Elihu Root, he said McKinley deserved the credit because he was a man of great power, because he was absolutely indifferent to credit. His great desire was to get it done. He cared nothing about the credit, but McKinley always had his way. He led them by the power of affectionate esteem, not by fear. He never bullied Congress. He never threatened compulsion. Both Democrats and Republicans respected his judgment. Remember, he had some political opposition certainly throughout his career, but no personal enemies. This was one of the most likable politicians in the history of the United States. Well, the National Republican Convention meeting in Philadelphia here in 1900. And of course, there's no question what was going to happen for the presidential nomination. That was going to be unanimous for William McKinley. But there was a question on the vice presidency. McKinley's friend Garret Hobart had died the previous November, so the vice presidency was now open. And a lot of the momentum was gearing toward Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, one of the heroes in the Spanish-American War for the fighting on San Juan Hill in Cuba, had recently been elected governor of New York. He was only 41 years old, and frankly, he wanted to be governor more than he wanted to be vice president, so he had already put out a statement in February of 1900 that said, "It is proper for me to state definitely that under no circumstances could I or would I accept the nomination for the vice presidency." Done deal, right? Not so fast. He came to Philadelphia as a delegate from New York, and there was a huge push in his direction to get him to run for vice president. Multiple state contingencies came to his hotel room, pushing him to try to run. And there was also an interesting twist of the people who wanted him in that race. People from his home state of New York. Tom Platt was one of the political bosses, and some of his colleagues, they wanted Roosevelt to run for the vice presidency, not because they supported him, because they wanted him out of New York. He was a reformer. He was not good news for the political class, the political bosses in the state. They figured, what better way to get rid of him? Have him go be vice president. Get out of our hair, we'll elect somebody else. So everybody had their reasons pushing Roosevelt for the vice presidency. There were only two names that didn't really want Roosevelt to run. Roosevelt was one. The other was pretty important. The head of the Republican National Committee and one of McKinley's top supporters, Mark Hanna. And he was the chair of this convention, and Hanna didn't want to have anything to do with Theodore Roosevelt. He thought he was too young, too brash. He was a troublemaker. He tried everything he could to look elsewhere during the convention to find somebody else to put up, but frankly, everybody turned him down. But there was still some friction being developed. You got to remember, at this time, presidents didn't choose their vice presidential candidates. They always left that up to the party, in this case, the Republican convention. And there was a little bit of a fracture going on because Hanna was pushing a little too hard. Word got back to the White House, and McKinley had to shut it down. He sent not one but two telegrams to the convention, well, a second of which said the president's close friend should be satisfied with his unanimous nomination and not interfere with the vice presidential nomination. The administration wants the choice of the convention, and the president's friends must not dictate to the convention. By the second telegram, Hanna got the message. He stood down. The nominations went forward. McKinley unanimous, Roosevelt unanimous, well, except for one. One person refused to vote. Theodore Roosevelt abstained for the vice presidential nomination. Other than that, both were unanimous. Now, McKinley himself wasn't going to campaign, but he did agree one campaign address. He did it the old-fashioned way, just like he did 4 years before on his home front porch in Canton, Ohio, where he accepted the nomination formally. And he said, The Republican Party broke the shackles of 4 million slaves and made them free, and to the party of Lincoln has come another supreme opportunity, which it has bravely met in the liberation of 10 million of the human family from the yoke of imperialism. This was his analogy. As Lincoln had freed the American slaves, McKinley in the United States had freed all these people in Cuba and the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to eventually get them their own independent countries, but not quite yet. Again, there was still some tension going on. There was still a rebellion, or an insurrection rather, going on in the Philippines. Many of them thought this was more of not liberation, but more oppression and imperialism, but not the American people. The American people were completely on board with the direction that McKinley was taking the country, both domestically and internationally. There was one person not thrilled about McKinley being renominated, and that was his wife, Ida. She thought, enough's enough, time to go home. Ida McKinley said, I did not want him to run a second time. I thought he'd done enough for the country, and when his term expires, he'll come home. We'll settle down quietly, and he will belong to me. That simply was not going to happen because the country wasn't done with him yet. Now, the Democrats, they went back to William Jennings Bryan, the man that McKinley had beaten 4 years before. In the previous campaign, Bryan was all about silver. That issue had gone away, so now he's all about anti-imperialism. That issue had small pockets of support, but by and large, the country was unified around the president. By the way, one of the most effective campaigners was Theodore Roosevelt. He traveled to 24 states, gave 600 speeches, very effective on the stump, and this was a pretty easy victory for McKinley and Roosevelt over Bryan, 292 to 155 in the Electoral College. Inauguration Day, it was raining, but for the first time, the government had finally put up a reviewing stand that covered the president, so even if it was raining, he could give his address. This was a very different speech from 4 years before, which was dominated by the economy and only a brief mention on foreign affairs. This was kind of the opposite. He did take a victory lap on the economy, as he did on foreign affairs, but that latter part was really the emphasis of the address. He acknowledged that there were still some challenges in Cuba and the Philippines, that there was an insurrection going on, but he believed the United States was on the right path in foreign affairs and said, we are not waging war against the inhabitants of the Philippine Islands. A portion of them are making war against the United States. We will not leave the destiny of the loyal millions on the islands to the disloyal thousands who are in rebellion against the United States. And fortunately for McKinley, that rebellion would actually come to a close in just about a month. As we talked about in a previous episode, Enrique Aguinaldo, the leader of that insurrection, was finally captured just a month into McKinley's second term. He put out a statement to bring that to an end, and this was an opportunity to finally transition to the civilian government under William Howard Taft by July 4th of 1901. So again, all things moving in the right direction for William McKinley. At the beginning of a new presidential term, Congress traditionally went into recess. They did again here, and this was an opportunity for McKinley to take a trip, to go through the South and the West with his wife, business and pleasure, make some speeches, but also meet people and have a good time. And things started out fine on the trip, but then they took a little bit more of an ominous turn. Ida McKinley suffered a bone felon on her index finger, and it got inflamed. Doctors treated it, they lanced it, but it wasn't healing. In fact, it was getting worse and it was affecting her entire well-being, at the point where McKinley eventually called off all the stops on the tour. They settled into a home in San Francisco, which is where they were at the time, to try to nurse her back to health. And there was a question, frankly, of whether or not she was going to make it. In and out of consciousness, the doctors weren't so sure. McKinley never left her side, holding her hand, talking to her, praying with her. And eventually, by the second week, she did start to recover a bit, well enough ultimately to travel by train back to Washington, D.C. They made that trip. And by June, she was well enough for a visit home to Canton, Ohio, where she and her husband would spend the summer, finally doing a little bit better. Now, because of Ida McKinley's illness, McKinley himself had had to cancel a number of the stops on that tour, but one of the places he still really wanted to get to was in the Northeast. This was in Buffalo, the Pan-American Exposition, a World's Fair going on in Buffalo, and he wanted to go there to launch his economic agenda for the second term. He was going to make a change. He had always been for one thing: protection, high protective tariff. But right now, and when he gave his speech to 50,000 people on September 5th of 1901, he was pivoting pivoting in a new direction. According to the president, the day of exclusiveness was past. Protective tariffs and commercial wars no longer serve their purpose. Reciprocity agreements and sensible trade arrangements should take the place of retaliatory measures. They would open up new channels for America's expanding surplus products. He wasn't focused as much on imports now as he was on exports as part of the American economy. He saw this as a change for the better, and he advocated as such. The rest of this trip was just supposed to be some pleasure, relaxation. He and his wife Ida went the next morning on a brief trip to Niagara Falls. They came back for the afternoon. Ida went to the home of John Milburn, where they were staying, where she was going to rest up. Well, the president was going to a reception back at the exposition. Now, his secretary, George Cortelyou, tried to talk him out of it. He thought there was risk associated with this, didn't want to see his president out in public. Meeting the people was something the president liked to do, but it had some risk. He was advised to cancel. And McKinley looked at Cortelyou and said, "Why should I? No one would wish to hurt me." Well, McKinley was in a joyous mood as he bounded up the stairs into the Temple of Music where he was holding this reception. The reception line was actually out the door. There were so many people who wanted to say hello and shake his hand. Security was by his side, but no one seemed to pay attention to the man who had a bandage wrapped entirely around his right hand. This man slowly got to the front of the line. When he got to the line, McKinley saw the bandage was wrapped, so McKinley reached out with his right hand to the man's left. That left his midsection, the president's midsection, exposed. The man raised that right hand under the bandage and he fired 2 shots from the revolver that was hidden from the bandage. McKinley went down. All of a sudden, we had to find out now about Leon Czolgosz. Leon Czolgosz was 26 years old. He was an anarchist. He didn't actually have anything against William McKinley. He had something against all political leaders. This anarchist movement really had gotten going in Europe, where some assassination attempts had occurred. It was small but growing in the United States as well. What were they for? Well, Alexander Berkman was one of the anarchists, and he put it this way: "The killing of a tyrant, of an enemy of the people, is in no way to be considered as the taking of a life. To remove a tyrant is an act of liberation, the giving of life and opportunity to an oppressed people." Most rulers they considered to be tyrants. Now, Czolgosz himself was actually inspired by an American anarchist by the name of Emma Goldman. He saw her give a speech, and he believed it was his duty to take out the American president. All governments are evil, rulers need to be taken out, and he decided to act. He went to a local store in Buffalo, bought a .32 caliber revolver, started stalking the president in his trip to Buffalo. His last chance was this reception. This is where he took it, and he played those 2 shots into President McKinley. Well, McKinley was immediately rushed to the Exposition Medical Facility, which was really tiny, mostly a first aid station. There was a call then to come out for surgeons in the area, someone who could help take care of the president. Dr. Matthew Mann was one of the first to respond, and he went, did perform surgery on the president. He looked for the bullet. He couldn't find it. He did see that it had gone through the stomach. Now, this was the second bullet. One had actually hit a button on McKinley's coat and went off to the side, didn't cause any damage. The other went directly under the navel, through the stomach. Mann was able to repair the entry and the exit wound, but he never found the bullet. He stitched up the president, wanted to get him back to recovery, back to the Milburn house as quickly as possible. Now, Ida McKinley, who was not known for being calm, was very calm in this case. As her husband had taken care of her all these years, she knew this was her time to take care of him, and she was sort of happy to do it and energized around this opportunity to get her husband back to health. Word went out around the country. Politicians all over the place converged on Buffalo. Hanna, Dawes, cabinet members, former Secretary William Day, the Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, all came to check on the president. And the fact is, he was slowly improving. Day after day, the bulletins from the doctors were actually reasonably optimistic, so that these politicians and friends eventually started to go about their business. Let's let the president recover by himself. But then September 12th, things started to take a turn for the worse. The doctors were no longer as optimistic. There was bacteria growing inside the president, an infection that had turned to gangrene, and it was basically permeating his entire body. The president was dying, and now they had to get word to get those politicians back, in particular the vice president, who they kind of lost track of. He had gone on vacation in the Adirondack Mountains. They weren't even sure exactly where he was, so somebody was trying to hunt him down because it didn't look like the president had much time left. The next day, September 13th, the president is growing weaker and weaker. He's spending his last couple of moments with his wife, Ida, and he says to the room, "Goodbye, goodbye all." When he whispered to Ida, "It is God's way. His will, not ours, be done." After that, he was going in and out. He could be heard humming his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee." And at 2:15 the following morning on September the 14th, 1901, President William McKinley died. Well, services were held throughout the week, first at the Milburn house, where a number of mourners gathered. After that, he was due to lay in state at the Buffalo City Hall, right there locally, and people could pay their respects. Then put on a train back to the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. The first stop there was at the White House for some private viewing and some private time for Ida McKinley to spend with her husband's body inside that coffin. The funeral procession then went down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol, where the casket was carried into the rotunda for, again, laying in state in the National Rotunda and the Capitol for President McKinley. After that, it was on a final train ride back to Canton, Ohio, where the entire town basically came out to finally pay their last respects. It was a few years later that a full memorial was built for William McKinley. He was reinterred there in 1907. William McKinley spent almost an entire career in public service, beginning as a teenager when he volunteered as an 18-year-old private to go into the Civil War. He ended that war as a major. That was the nickname that he kept throughout most of his career. He became a lawyer. He became a congressman, focused on the tariff. He had passed the McKinley tariff, one of the highest at the time, peacetime tariffs in American history, which was a big success in his mind, kind of the capper of his congressional career. He did lose his congressional seat after that, but then spent a couple of terms as a governor before eventually getting an opportunity to run with partnering with Mark Hanna for the presidency of the United States. He won that, and it was a transformational presidency. Economy got booming under his watch as he got his economic plan in place, but it was really on the international stage, where it kind of broke American tradition and got involved in a foreign conflict between the Cuban rebels and their Spanish overlords. The United States had traditionally stayed out of these kinds of conflicts. Neutrality had been the watchword of the United States, but not in this case. There were a series of actions that led McKinley to intervene, and not only did they take Cuba, but they knocked out, thanks to the U.S. Navy, both fleets for the Spanish, both in the Caribbean as well as in the Pacific and the Philippines. They took Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and all of a sudden, the United States was transformed on William McKinley's watch onto the world stage as a global leader. Now, some saw this as imperialism. That was not William McKinley's term. He saw it as liberation, expansion, and opportunity. But one thing was not in dispute. The United States certainly became much more of a world power on William McKinley's watch, but he would not be around to see it because of the assassin, Leon Czolgosz, taking his life in Buffalo, New York in 1901. That is William McKinley, Reelection and Assassination, from the life of William McKinley. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.